This is Matt Brown, and you're listening to Just a Good Conversation. Having photography in one's life can be a wonderful thing. My guest Bruce Chambers found it through church, and it changed his life in many ways. It did take him a few years to understand the power of the camera and making an image.
We took this gorgeous picture in a barn, I think of a horse, and the light was gorgeous. And I said, how did you do that? We're in the darkroom, and I'm watching this picture come up. I'm like, how did you do that? And he just looks at me, kind of a smart ass, but I love him. And he says, I shot it right in the first place.
I'm Matt Brown, host of Just a Good Conversation. Take a listen to our archives. My guests have ranged from professional photographers, news anchors, Emmy winners, and gold medal volleyball winner, Jordan Larson.
For me, I've always kind of played like a little bit of with like a chip on my shoulder in a good way. Like I think that I've always felt like I've had something to prove. Like I've always had to like push the razor's edge, push the boundary. And I think I'm grateful for that. I also think that I wish I would have been maybe a little more like relaxed in certain situations. Like I think sometimes I was so focused on certain things that like I wasn't really paying attention on what was really happening around me.
The rest of my conversation with Jordan can be found on our archives at justagoodconversation.com. Let's take a quick break for a sponsor before diving into part one of my conversation with Bruce Chambers. I have the honor, the privilege to sit with you, Bruce Chambers. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Matt?
It's so good to see you.
Yeah,
when was the last time we saw each other?
Oh, man, it's got to be decades. Because, you know, I was working my daily job and you were working freelance, so it's probably at a ball game somewhere.
No, because you were doing that early morning thing for like...
Oh, yeah. So for 8 years, I probably didn't see you either.
Right.
Yeah, I used to work at 6 to 2 as the breaking news photographer, so which was a sweet hourly gig, kind of a traumatic job.
It's like dawn patrol every day for a grown man.
Well, yeah, and it was, I used to actually shoot the sunset.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, sunrise about every other day, just because I was up before the sun, and, you know, it just gave me something else to throw into my resume of things to do that day, because I had to justify my existence and stay out of the office, you know, one of the two.
Tell me this, did you find photography or did photography find you?
That's a hard one. It pretty much found me, but, you know, as a kid, I used to backpack a lot with my family, and I had a little Instamatic, and I'd shoot pictures, and they'd look like crap because it was a crap camera. And I remember one time my cousin saying, that's a pretty good photograph, you know, maybe you should like get serious. And I didn't. And I went to Cal State Fullerton, which is a long story, but well, the long story is I was in high school. I was in band, and I was a musician, played trumpet, played piano, but I knew I wasn't good enough to be a professional musician.
You weren't going to be Chet Baker in any way?
No way. I never practiced, so it was a horrible, you know, take about 14 years of piano lessons and shove them into like maybe 3 years of practicing, you know, it was horrible. So
I'm sure your mother was very happy for all the hours she spent.
Yeah, paying for that as a single mom. So I knew that I wasn't going to be a musician. So in my senior year, I became a Jesus freak. I hadn't gone to church in a while, and they had this new youth pastor, and they said, come on down. And he's like hardcore, you know, you need Jesus, you don't want to go to hell, all this stuff. And I had like a hole in my heart at that point. And my father had moved out when I was 10. It wasn't much in my life. And so hearing about some God that would like love me no matter what, and, you know, we even called him Father God. I mean, I had been raised in the church, but my mom is very do your own thing. So I had quit going to church. So not only did I accept his offer, quote unquote, to be born again and all that stuff, I became the leader of the youth group. And so in my senior year in high school, I was leading a pretty rocking youth group. It had about 200 members. We had a lot of up-and-coming Christian bands visiting with us and all this stuff. So I had kind of like the pressure to be a pastor. And I applied at UCLA, Fullerton, Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and I was accepted at all of them. But I couldn't afford any of them except for Cal State Fullerton. So I went to Cal State Fullerton, and I was a religious studies major when I started. So to get back to your question, this is how photography found me. When I was in my senior year, this crazy Southern Baptist youth pastor who had snuck into my Presbyterian church, long story, had a camera, and he said, why don't you take some pictures? And he handed me this like Minolta SRT 101, fully no automatic anything, mechanical camera. And I thought it was fun because we learned how to, process and stuff. And then when I went to Cal State, I still had the camera, and
so he gave you the camera?
He said, keep the camera. And I'm like, okay, well, that's amazing because I couldn't have possibly afforded that camera. So I thought, I'll take a photo class. So I took Introduction to Photo, which is hilarious. It was like one of those, 500 people in a class taught by the TA, and you're supposed to, follow the professor's book, so that he made money. He'd show up about once a semester and say hi. And I basically got a C in that class because I just didn't put the effort into it, which was amazing because I'm like, that's another long story. I'm like driven to succeed. So I can't believe I got a C in that class. But anyways,
Would you like to retake it in any way?
Well, I wanted to no. I wanted to do it again, so I wanted to take intermediate photography, but then it started to cost money because you had to buy film, you had to process your film, they had a lab, but you had to pay for the chemistry and all that, paper. So I did that, and I got an A, and it was fun. And then I think I took another class, and that was fun. But then I started to, I was putting myself through Cal State Fullerton, and I was like, and I was a religious studies major, and that was, the idea originally was, I'll spend 2 years here, then I'll switch over to Christian college or something and become a pastor. Well, in those 2 years, I realized that I wasn't pastor material, that I didn't really want that lifestyle. And then photography started to become interesting. And at one point, I was like, how could I finance this hobby, avocation, whatever? I never really thought about it as being a job. And I was like in love with Ansel Adams, and my mom had like raised me on Life magazine, Look magazine, Time magazine, National Geographic. I had no idea that she always wanted to be Margaret Burke-White. I had no idea until I was actually in the business doing my job that was her desire in college. But she, somehow subliminally gave me all these ideas. And so she's a huge part of that. But I found out that I don't remember who told me this, but they said, if you go work for the Daily Titan, which is the Cal State Fullerton daily newspaper, they pay for your film, they pay for your paper. All you have to have is a 35 millimeter camera. You can work there, get credit for it. So I switched my major to communications with a photo emphasis. I went and worked for the paper first semester. It was fun.
What was that like, right? I mean, there's a difference between taking introduction class. All of a sudden now there's daily assignments in which you really haven't had any exposure to.
I wish I had the photograph. The first published photograph I ever had is a horrendous piece of crud. It's horrible. It was like a posed picture. It was like we had a story about handicap access on campus, and there was a bunch of staircases in campus where people in wheelchairs couldn't go. So I had a guy in a wheelchair at the top of the stairs, posed, and then I like hand of God burned the top of it. It was awful, you know, but it was exciting. I'm sure you know, to get published, and it was like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. I still wanted to be Ansel Adams, but I quickly realized that era of making a living, being a landscape photographer, was pretty far out of reach.
Right.
So this whole thing about working for newspapers sounded pretty cool. I mean,
did you feel like a fire for it? I mean, was it immediate, like when you were first on the staff, kind of like, my God, this is a love? Or was it slow burning?
it's a slow burn. I always say there's like two kinds of photographers that I've met, photojournalists. And some are like savants, and some of them are like me, where you build all the time on your skills, on your desire. You know, the interesting thing is I work with a couple people. Like there was a guy named Peter Schluter who was on my Daily Titan staff, and he was amazing. He had an internship with the San Bernardino Sun. At the time, that paper had the best staff in California, and he would come back, and we had horrible professors. They really were out of their element. And, you know, I didn't go to Cal State to become a photography student, but I did. And then I later wished I had gone to a different college. But
Right.
we pretty much created a community around the Daily Titan of people who learned from each other from our internships. And even Peter, you know, he went on to, like, he went on to work for newspapers. He was on an assignment in Afghanistan during the Russian war and was almost killed by the Russians, and his reporter was killed. And then he like came back, and he had to walk out of the country because he had to pretend he was dead. They took all of his photographs. He was doing a story on Doctors Without Borders. It's getting a little long, but the long story short, Peter did go back, do that story. It was amazing. But his brain works so fast, I don't think he really wanted to deal with the business of photojournalism.
Right.
So he became a lawyer.
What?
And he's still a lawyer. In fact, first he became a lawyer to sue photo agencies who didn't pay their bills, because he was always getting burned as a freelancer. But then he morphed into protecting or being a defense lawyer for people who get beat up by cops and things like that. But that was kind of my introduction to these. He was just flat out amazing with like hardly any education, you know. And it was like, I think of people like Bruce Strong, who used to work with me at the Register. When he was like 21, I remember his portfolio hit the table when he was looking for a job, and all the veterans were just staring at it like, oh my God, if we were only this good when we were 21, you know?
Right.
And Bruce did that well, but he became like a Syracuse professor of photojournalism, still is, and raised entire generations of photographers, you know? It was, I don't know why, you know, but then there's people like me. I think I won't name names because I don't want to peg people, but a good amount of the photographers I work with over the years just became better every year. There's always some hotshot that kind of had it going on, but you know, there's those people you swear they sold their soul to the devil because they could manually focus, you know, a football coming right at you, you know, and,
Right.
Before autofocus, and, you know, and they got everything, and you're like, oh my God, how did, you know, but, you know, I think, you know, some of us, you know, we like fine wines, you know, we just got better with age. And I think actually right now, probably don't have the energy to be like a photojournalist, but my skills are like at peak. But I don't really have the desire to use it the way I used to use it because I've gone other places. But, you know, as far as the burning desire, I think the burning desire started to come when, like, I did an internship at the LA Times.
What did that portfolio look like?
Well, my portfolio was awful. The one that I had from Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Fullerton was ridiculous. It was like they had a rule. I don't know whose rule. I guess it was probably the faculty advisor. You can only shoot things that are campus related. So we couldn't go out and do like,
What?
yeah, they didn't want stories that weren't campus related. So my whole portfolio was like
You
shot on.
missed so much.
Yeah, well, that was the way it was. So it was like I did some off-campus stuff for other classes, like my art photography class and stuff. But I just didn't have the breadth of anything. I like my news photo was a picture of a campus officer walking down the hallway with a gun, looking for a man with a gun. But they walk right past the Daily Titan, so I just kind of followed until I got told to knock it off. But that was like my only newsy kind of picture, So, in fact, my internship, that is another thing. There was no Good Old Boys network at Cal State Fullerton. The professors didn't know anybody.
Right.
So their job offers were like, go work at a photo finishing place. I was like, you got to be kidding me. Everybody had to have an internship, but then I found out that one of the people, I think it was Al Gamboa is his name, had worked at the Daily Titan, had got an internship with the Downey Long Beach like community section of the LA Times.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh. So I called them up, and they're like, no, we don't have a position. But they misunderstood me, thinking I was a writer. And then somebody said, no, you need to call Michael Malley. He's the photographer on staff there. He's kind of been exiled from the main office. He's not in good standing with Con Keys, who's the director of photography. So he's like doing the whole section himself, and he loves interns because it takes part of the weight off of him, right? So I got that internship. Raleigh Southern and I got it, and I took, I took the northern half, I think. He took like the Long Beach section, I took like the Downey section. We didn't get paid. We got free film, free paper, mileage, and access to the LA Times Orange County darkroom.
Wow.
But, so we were hanging out with like people like Mark Boster and Steve Rice, Don Kelson, the old guard of the Orange County Times. And that was awesome. That's when it started to, like, lights are going on. And I was pretty young.
What was the thing sparking those lights going on? Just seeing how they worked and how they operated?
Well, I don't know about that, because some of those guys were just kind of like tired of their jobs, and they're really good photographers, but they were just kind of like feet on the desk. My opportunity as an intern was I could do anything I wanted, and the writers would get excited about it because they didn't have new ideas. Okay. So, I remember talking to a reporter, I think in the Downey office, and he was like, "What do you want to do, kid?" And I really was a kid. I was like literally like 20, and I looked like I was 16, and if that. And I have baby face at the time. I still do, but I have a beard now. But what do you want to do? And I'm like, can we go hang out with the cops in Compton? And he's like, sure. Can we ride with the fire department, the busiest fire department in town for like a night? Sure. And I went out and did these things. I remember I didn't even know how to use a strobe. And because you didn't
have one, right?
I didn't have one. I might have had one, but I didn't really. I borrowed one from Michael Rondo, who was my best friend in college and at the Daily Titan. And I was on this ride along with the Compton cops, and the first call was officer in trouble, which is something you never hear. And it was officer holding back an angry mob in a diner at the door. And the white guy had run into somebody, and they wanted to kill him. And that started the night. And then I heard this call of this domestic violence thing. And so, this is probably like one of those moments where I'm like, oh, yeah, you could really make a living at this. It's kind of exciting. And so we arrive, and this woman had called her on her husband, a black couple, and it was an apartment, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, got this giant potato masher strobe, and I just pointed at them, and I shoot a frame. Then I think, hey, if you turn this around and kick it off the wall, this thing's so powerful, it's going to have this nice, beautiful lighting effect. And in the next frame, the guy had told the cops, the woman said, I don't want him to go to jail, even though she called him, right? And he says, I'm not going anywhere. So 3 white cops grab this guy by the hair, they're yanking him back, and I shoot the frame, and I win a national clip, you know? And then the next assignment with the fire department, I win another clip. And I started winning clip contests as a college kid, and I'm out shooting the LA Times staff, you know? So then I thought, but then it became, I couldn't get a job at the LA Times. It was
What year is this?
This is 79.
Okay.
And I couldn't get a job with the LA Times. They just weren't hiring people, and they certainly weren't hiring young people. And
you needed to be established at that point to get a job.
Well, there was 2 factors. I didn't have the old boys club influence from Cal State Fullerton.
Right.
Long Beach had a pretty good deal, and Wayne Kelly, working there, had been the photo editor of the Herald Examiner before he started to teach, and he got all sorts of his grads jobs
Because he knew people.
Yeah, there.
Like he can make a call.
Yeah.
I
I
got
walked
a guy.
into the Herald Examiner with my portfolio when it was a little beefed up from my internships. And then I did a following internship at the Long Beach paper. And so I was, and again, it was like these old guys, like on a Sunday, had come in to work, and they'd be like feet up on the desk reading the comics. And they're like, hey, you want to shoot the Raider game? Because I don't feel like it. And I'm like, yeah. You know, so I got all this good stuff because, you know, it took work, but they didn't want to deal with it. So I went into job interviews for instance, I go into the job with Con Keys at the LA Times because everybody's like, you should go fly, you know. And he looks at my portfolio, and he's got this reputation of just being a hard ass and telling people their stuff is crap, right? And he looks at my portfolio and he goes, what do you think? And I go, what do you think of your stuff? I go, I think it's kind of mediocre. I really need more experience to rise, you know? I said, there's a few good pictures in there, but I would love to have half of it gone and replaced with this stuff. He was shocked. He had not heard that kind of honesty. So, you know, he gave me like a tour around the office for like an hour. We chatted, and then all these guys that I knew from the Times were like, is he going to hire you? And I'm like, no, you know? But so that was just my experience for like a year. I'd go to a paper, and they'd say, you're great, but you're young, you need experience. It was this catch-22. You really need experience. And so
It didn't help that you probably looked all of 16 still.
Right, exactly. And I was like, okay.
My mom drove me here, so I need a ride back.
Well, the worst thing happened was I sent my portfolio to Rochester, New York. Dick Sroda was the photo editor there, and he'd been the photo editor at the San Bernardino Sun-Telegram. And at the time he was the boss there, they were the perennial clip winners. They had a killer staff. And the Gannett Newspapers noticed that and asked him to come to Rochester, which is their flagship paper, and re-up the quality of they had 2 papers with 1 photo staff, and they wanted to make that a very good paper photographically, and it was in the town where Kodak was, so it was like, you know, this is a no-brainer. We should be like one of the best photo newspapers.
We can't be embarrassing. My God, we're in the yellow
so they
box
hired
country.
him. I sent him my portfolio because I used to bug the people I got a job, my first job, full-time job, at the Palm Springs Desert Sun in their bureau, which meant I worked with 3 reporters, 1 editor, and myself in this little tiny building, like, what is that, like 25 miles from Palm Springs.
Now, how was it getting your first job, right? Like, you're out of college, you graduate, like, you get this job. Are you excited, nervous? Like, it's real now. You're an adult, even though you got the face of a 16-year-old, and you're driving out to Palm Springs in a new area. I mean...
Oh, it was crazy. I was like, I felt like I was settling because I couldn't get a job anywhere in LA. And I had like a line, like the Long Beach paper loved me, but they didn't have an opening. So they were trying to get me a job at the Pasadena paper, which was a sister paper at the time. And, that there was somebody that had an inside track for that. So that was up in the air. So I go out to interview for this job, and they kind of had hack photographers there. So when I showed them my portfolio, they're like, whoa, when do you want to work? And I'm like, tomorrow? Because by now I'd spent so much time and money. At one point I sent my portfolio to New York, and they kept it for like 6 months. And in those days, you only had one portfolio because it was a box of prints that were perfect that you printed in your friend's bathroom. And everything else were second prints because, it's not digital. You can't just Photoshop it. So
little magenta, a little off.
Well,
cutting on the border wasn't perfect.
This is all black and white in this.
Oh,
era,
right. Yeah,
right.
that's your.
So it's like,
your best burn and dodge.
Yeah, all that. Yeah, you had to memorize what you did to the last picture to improve on it or replicate it, and didn't always work because.
Had you shot any color yet?
I had shot color for fun, but not on assignment.
Okay, so every assignment though, right now at this point, is black and white.
Yep.
What is it? Do you remember what it was? What kind of film?
It's Tri-X.
Okay.
Yeah, Kodak, Tri-X, 100, 400. Usually 400. And
gave you that variable.
Yeah, so I just couldn't land a job, so I took that job, and I had to move out there. I always say, not a huge fan of Palm Springs. My wife loves the place, but I'm like.
Now you guys are dating at this time, right?
Yeah, we're actually engaged. I've been dating my wife since I was 17 years old.
Right.
And she was 14. So we waited 7 years, and we were engaged to be married like in 82 and 81, at the beginning of 81, and I was working in Palm Springs in 80. And yeah, it was fun. It was kind of cool because they had an empty page every week that you could shoot a photo essay to, actually. And they just used to fill it with junk. And I was like shooting like, it was in an era of black and white photo pages. And I would even lay them out. I was also the editor of the F10 forum for the newsletter for the National Press Photographers Association. That's a long story how I got that gig. It's just like my old intern boss just didn't want to do it anymore. He's like, do this.
All these old guys are just throwing stuff at you.
Yeah, well, the guy that gave me the job at the LA Times intern was best friends with the guy who was in charge of the photo department at Long Beach. So I worked for nothing for the LA Times. Then I got paid to be an intern at Long Beach. And while I was there, Mark Wigington, he was kind of in charge of the artists and the photographers. He was doing the F10 for me. He was tired of it. So he said, you do it. Well, that gave me an incredible entree into the business because I could interview anybody I wanted because I was going to publish what they had to say for the Western United States Region 10. And so like the flying short course with the National Press Photographers Association would come to town. I'd line up the headliners and hey, I'm the guy. Mm-hmm. And we'd sit out I'd have a tape recorder. We'd sit in a stairwell and I'd ask them like, well, when you took that Pulitzer, what were you thinking? And I remember like George Wedding shot this picture of a guy from a helicopter after Mount St. Helens blew up. George Wedding was like one of the most recent photographers of the year. And he was on the tour and he had shot this picture of father and son who died in the explosion of Mount St. Helens, and they were in the back of their pickup truck and covered in soot. And he took this picture, and it was like obviously traumatic. And so I interviewed him on how the family reacted to that photo, and he had a discussion with the wife, and those kind of stories were just my entree again into the world of photojournalism. And he used that as he used my article as his Pulitzer entry. He didn't win, but it was one of the best pictures of the year, one of the most amazing pictures of the year. And it also kind of triggered that whole debate in my mind when you're a journalist of shooting tragedy, how it affects the people you're photographing, which kind of leads into my whole how I became a journalist and then became a therapist.
Right.
But that job was okay, but I was working by myself. The other photographer in Palm Springs wasn't his career, but he wasn't very good, and he wasn't a mentor of any sort.
So you're really on your own.
I was on my own, and I was looking to get out of there. In fact, one day...
And you're young. I mean, you're very influential on, like, somebody being a mentor can really help you and guide you.
Oh,
and
yeah,
stuff.
it was unbelievable. And I used to drop by the San Bernardino paper hoping they'd hire me someday. Just bugged them constantly.
Who was there at the time?
Don Black, who became... I think he moved to the Register. I'll see. Don Black, Greg Schneider... What was the guy named Kite? I can't remember his name. I have a 66-year-old brain. But they literally had like the top 3 photographers in the region.
Okay, so I had Paul on. He said the same thing, Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell were they doing in San Bernardino at that point that made them just on fire?
Well, part of it was San Bernardino is the largest county in the world.
Yeah.
Definitely in the United States.
It's bigger than some of our states.
Right. So they had a bunch of regional sections, and so they would, if they lost, they would do a photo, they would be allowed to go do a photo story, paste it up, write it, and it would look the way they wanted it to look, and it'd sit in a box until a full-page ad didn't sell in one of the regions, and they would drop it in. And they get published. So
their advantage in clip contest was having this perfect settled art.
Right. They were ahead of the curve on photo design, and photo design used to win awards over the content sometimes. Right. And a lot, especially in the clip contests, because the clip contest actually was a tear sheet out of the newspaper. It wasn't a digital file or anything. So if your picture was like 3 inches across versus a full page photo, who's going to win? You know, when other photographers are judging this, they're just like, wow, you know,
big is better.
Wish I worked there. You know,
yeah, exactly. The phrase that we've all heard.
I think Tom Castor, that's the name that just popped back in my head. So like Tom, God rest his soul, I don't remember when he passed, but he was just a gonzo photojournalist who was constantly doing stories, just, you know, never slept. He would win, like every year he'd be the regional photographer of the year, and there's somebody else would bring up the rest. And Sroda was their boss for a long time, the guy that I worked for in Rochester, but he had left. So I was always begging for a job there. And so when I'd come back to Orange County to see my girlfriend, fiance, spend the weekend, and I'd stop in San Bernardino and show them my pictures. And you were talking about brutal brother stuff. Earlier when we were on mic, they would give me the rash of shit about my stuff. Like, for instance, my darkroom was a broom closet, literally 2 broom closets with a wall torn down, had some light leaks in it, and I had an old Bezier enlarger that you would tighten it down and focus it in, and you had about 5 seconds before that thing would slip out of focus.
Oh, no.
So, you know, in a newspaper with giant dots, you wouldn't see that. But when you're looking at a print, they're like, what is your enlarger on the back of your, you know...
Horse?
Is it on the washing machine? What's the deal? And they had the best. They had Leica enlargers, you know, and they were just like sharp as a tack, and, you know... So they gave me crap all the time. But eventually, Sroda was like trying to hire photographers cheap. So he hired a bunch of photographers from... I have to tell this story. So I sent my portfolio to him, and he was hiring a bunch of California photographers. And he held my portfolio for like 6 months. And I was like, when I was working in the Desert Sun, and I was like, dude, send it back. I need it, you know, because I'm still trying to get a better job. And he's like, I didn't, you know, he kept saying, the company doesn't want to fly you out here for an interview. We're waiting for the corporate jet to be there and all this stuff. And then finally he says, well, the truth of the matter is my publisher doesn't want me to hire Californians anymore. And I said, really, why? And he goes, because they always stay 2 years and leave, you know. They go on to better things, supposedly, you know. And he just thinks that Californians are flakes because they don't like this, snow-ridden
Right.
upstate New York.
Real weather.
Real weather.
Yeah. As you're sitting in Palm Springs sweating your keister off.
Yeah, exactly.
You're as tan as this table, probably.
Yeah, I have film melting in my pocket, It, literally. And
you're like, listen, I can do it. Trust me.
I got pissed off, and I was like, really? And that ruined some of my chances. Not that I probably would have got the jobs because the same old, you're too young, you don't have experience, song and dance I had with all the local newspapers in LA, which is one of the most competitive places at the time, to get a job. So I knew I pretty much had to leave the state to get a job. So,
but that also, if you go to upstate New York, it also gives you your portfolio greater depth because you got weather, real weather you can kind of put in there. You get different sports, different looking people. I mean, Palm Springs, you're talking about half naked spring breakers,
or mostly geriatric golfers,
right? Or geriatric golfers
who want to stand still and they have like a 4-foot check, and you're supposed to shoot that. And I actually refused to shoot that. I got in so much trouble. I was like, I'm not shooting that. That's crap. That's grip and grin.
That's PR.
Yeah, well, I almost got fired one time because I think 6 months into the job, I had collected all of my negatives and I kind of categorized them. And about 20% of what I was shooting was actual news. Everything else was PR or advertising. And I go, look, I didn't go to J school for this. And they're like, we could fire you tomorrow or today. And I was like, make my day, literally. I'm kind of miserable right now, And so they quickly backed off because they knew that they weren't going to get somebody to come out.
Who's coming out tomorrow? Fill my spot.
Yeah. So they gave me a few perks, and my portfolio kind of got better because I started to be able to do my own photo pages and my own design. And I eventually did move into the Palm Springs main office because the guy retired, and then I could shepherd my work through because there's always somebody messing with my layouts.
Was that a bigger deal though to go from Palm Desert to Palm Springs? Was that a big step up?
No, it was actually just a pain in the ass to drive that far.
Okay.
Because I still lived in Palm Desert.
You didn't move?
No, I had I made $200 a week, and I think I paid $200 or $300 for my rent. And I was splitting my room at this time with Michael Rondo, who took my job in Palm Desert. So one of my best buddies and we were both working there. But it was just like the last 3 months I worked there. So anyways, I keep bugging the people at San Bernardino about a job, and then Sroda calls him, who's a hot shot young person I can pay nothing? And they're like, Chambers. So he had my portfolio forever. Then he tells me that the publisher doesn't want to hire Californians. So I wrote this letter. Somewhere I still have it because I got it back for some reason. But I wrote it to the publisher. And I'm like, you're a bigot. You're a bigot. I said, I'm a 4th generation Californian. My, great-grandfather homesteaded land in Central California. I said, I'm from a hardworking family that values the work ethic. And I would sweep your floors for, $2 an hour or whatever you're going to pay me. And I said, the fact that you categorize the most populous state as one kind of person is just bigotry, And my boss, my future boss, Dick Sroda, got in trouble for that because I didn't ask him. I just sent it, And because I was pissed because I had my portfolio forever, and I would go to.
And I don't think people realize how much of an anchor that was not to have your book. I mean, that's your lifeline to jobs.
I would have to go to job interviews with seconds because I couldn't just make a new portfolio. There's a guy named Glenn Koenig who I went to college with and who worked for the LA Times as a part-time contract photographer forever. He had an apartment in Fullerton, and he had his darkroom was better than mine at Palm Springs, so I had to print my stuff. Well, he and Peter Schluter were getting high out he was a total pothead, high out in the living room. I was in there printing my portfolios, and it cost me a fortune to do that, paper, chemistry,
right,
boards, and not, you didn't want anything. So anyways, I had driven all the way to Eugene, Oregon to see Brian Lanker and ask him for a job. And, Brian didn't give me a job, but he gave me great advice, helped me rebuild my portfolio, redesign some stuff. And going up and down the state, California, Oregon, I met all sorts of people who in the future became like second command at National Geographic, and, Brian Lanker himself, and George Wedding, and, who was the boss at Sacramento paper. And I just knew everybody because of all these connections, like the publication, applying for jobs, but I couldn't nail one. So he finally offered me to come out because he had a new publisher, and he just thought it was funny that I had that kind of
moxie.
Yeah. And, he kind of poo-pooed me. In fact, one of the first things, he gave me the job, and I got married, and I moved there with my
new bride.
And that was traumatic for her because she'd never lived anywhere but in her mom's house, and her mom had cancer, and she was like leaving mom behind and felt bad about it. And that drove a lot of my photographic history. Like, I only did stay 2 years in Rochester, but it had nothing to do with the weather. I thought the weather was awesome. And like you said, the whole experience was mind-blowing because I grew up in Southern California, deserty, like going to like the snow belt of America and being able to shoot like everything. I shot their baseball team. Cal Ripken was on their baseball team as a punk, his brother Billy, and his dad was the coach. They were the farm team for the Orioles. And I'm like, this guy's too skinny to play ball, and
he'll never make it.
Yeah, he'll never make it.
I'm Bruce Chambers. I'm a photographer. I'm a scout. I know.
I'm like, again, baby face, kind of longish hair. I remember I was at a game once, and the guy's like, it was Mike Boddicker, who went on to be a major league pitcher for the Orioles, and he's like, when are you going to get a haircut? And I go, when you win a game. And it was a silver stadium. It was like classic AAA stadium, advertisements on the outfield fence,
right,
that you're trying to like, which one do I really want an action picture that actually says something about this, or is it just crap, and we didn't have like f2.8 lenses, to blur things out. So it was just fun. You could sit on the roof of the stadium and shoot. You get hit by a ball, all that stuff, But yeah, I ended up getting that job, moving there. It changed my life because I then finally worked with a staff and a boss.
How big was the staff?
It's about 15 people.
Whoa.
And
you went from a one-man band to playing in a small orchestra.
Right. And I was this punk kid. I wasn't the youngest. There's Mike Schwartz, who's still working hard in Atlanta, was the youngest photographer on staff, but I think he kind of came in after me. There was the old guard and the new guard. There was everything Betty that he'd hired, that Sroda had hired, and then these older guys. And about half of them are really fine photographers. A couple of them are just slackers. And it was really hard. I don't know why. I don't know why some of them didn't just lose their jobs. But, some of them are like setup artists, like from the old days, like, that's a nice photograph. How it's convenient. The guy just showed up in the flooded thing with a canoe, how did that happen, You just knock on his door and say, hey, go get your canoe. So then somebody had this brilliant idea, like, let's have an in-house clip contest. So staff competed against each other. Well, I wasn't like, as I said before, I wasn't like the guy who's just a super clean, amazing photographer. I was just a hard worker. And I would hang out at my assignments for hours trying to get the moment, the real journalism.
Why giving yourself that much time to work at something and not just get the hell out?
Because I wanted to get better. I wanted to be somebody like Henri Bresson. I wanted to be Eugene Smith, who I find out later set up a lot of this stuff. But I wanted to be like a live photographer. I wanted to move from there to the Washington Post or the New York Times or the National Geographic.
You wanted to go up. And
I wanted to go up. I wanted to be better. So I would like put the time in. And I kept winning the clip contest. And some of the old guys were like, oh, he set this up. I wouldn't even be there sometimes when the staff was judging and I'd be out working. And they're like, oh, he set this up. And I'm like, I'd be irate. I'm like, no, I don't set stuff up. I never do. Never have. I never even learned how to like put somebody's head on another picture in Photoshop.
That was a real black mark to have someone.
You would get fired if at a quality newspaper for setup.
And we've all been around when we've seen it.
Yeah, when I worked at the Register, a couple old guys that when I first started there, that's all they ever did.
Right.
It was like, why do these people still work here? How can they have a job? But, anyways, I became the photographer of the year for them, and I was killing it. And I was enjoying the fact that I was in this completely new environment with seasons, full access to all the sports, just working a rotating shift, didn't have kids.
Were you putting in as much hours as you could?
Yeah. And
I've never seen you as an 8-hour kind of guy. Like you seem like you would, if it took another 45 minutes, you would stick around for it.
Certainly. But if it was worth the photo.
Right.
I did change later. That's part of my story is.
We all should evolve, right?
Well, let's get into that a little bit. The whole psychology of who I am. I'm a people pleaser in recovery. Hi, I'm Bruce Chambers. I'm a people pleaser. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
Yeah.
Hi, Bruce.
So
what are the donuts, Bruce?
So part of that is my father leaving when I was young and being a very critical, kind of angry guy. And I wanted to make him happy, but it was hard to do. And he thought this whole idea of being a photojournalist was idiotic because he worked for like aerospace and defense systems and computers, and he thought I had to have a real job. And there was a day when he visited me when I was working for the Tucson paper. He saw me do my job. He saw the picture in the paper the next day, and he was like, "Oh, now I get it." He realized like 3 years into my career that I saw more life than he'd ever seen, in 3 years. But I just became. Then he died when I was 28, and of cancer, and I just spent subconsciously always looking for a father figure, mentor, which I found one in a pastor once who just kind of used that willingness to do anything he told me to do it. I never hardly ever said no to my bosses about anything until I had kids. But then I wanted to spend some time with them. I'd start to say no, and then I'd have the arguments, with the bosses who were always understaffed and freaking out because they couldn't hire a freelancer for the weekend or whatever,
God forbid.
Yeah, but, Rochester, for instance, my mother-in-law did have terminal cancer, and this is in the days when there was no internet, there was no email, the only way you could talk to her was to do a long-distance phone call, which I couldn't even afford. So she came out once, and my wife just refused to, put roots down in Rochester because she was feeling guilty. She had older brother and sister, but they weren't really putting time in with her mom. And so 2 years into it, my wife was off getting her master's degree in one of the local colleges in New York. In fact, I had made a deal with my mother-in-law that I would never move to a place where she couldn't get that master's degree so she could do her job. So her mom came out for the graduation, and then she got line on a job without even talking to me, and up and left. I'm the photographer of the year at the paper, and on a track. I had friends at all these papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, that I wanted to, slide over here.
Mm-hmm.
And she leaves. And I'm like, great. So I told my boss I was quitting, He was pissed off at me. It wasn't Sroda at the time. Sroda got fired because his principles were too good, and he pushed back so many times they fired him.
Are you kidding?
No. In fact, it was the same time that the Gannett newspaper came out with USA Today. They were developing it while I was there. And I remember the first prototype hit the light table, and I asked my boss, Sroda, what do you think of that? And he's like, it's visual pollution. You know, it was this Mick paper, you know,
Right.
It was horrible.
Big color.
Yeah, well,
The red section, the blue section.
well, it was just chopped up, and it wasn't much of a paper. So
No.
it was like,
It was a hotel
yeah.
newspaper.
And so we were just like, oh, and Gannett was going that way. They wanted all the papers to be just like that.
Oh.
And it was the biggest newspaper chain in the world. You know, so my wife goes off. I tell my boss, my new boss, David Perdue, who ended up moving to Atlanta, I think, the Constitution, that I was quitting. He was mad at me. He's like, I can't believe your wife's telling you, you know, what to do. And I'm like, well, my marriage is more important than my job. So he didn't appreciate that. He was just, I heard he threw things. But I said, try to find me a job in the chain. And he couldn't really. But I had applied at the Tucson Citizen back in the day, and I called them up, and they're like, yeah, we'll hire you over the phone. So I
Over the phone.
over the phone.
Basically, now it's through reputation. We
Yeah.
remember you through Santa Barbara or from Palm Springs, and now we see what you're doing
Yeah, I
upstate.
had my brother-in-law is a senior vice president of one of the biggest, you know, Fortune 500 companies, and he's always telling me, if you want a really good job, put a suit on, go there in person, and I had done that back when I worked in Palm Springs, and the only reason I didn't get the job then was because like there's another brain fart. I can't remember the name, but one of the guy who had won Regional Photographer of the Year everywhere he ever went, maybe 15 times, had applied there. And they said, okay, we'll give the job to him. And then he decided he didn't really want to live in the desert. So,
Yeah, because Tucson is not Phoenix.
no. Well, that's a long story. But he ended up not taking the job. And they, you know, by then I'd moved on to something else. So, you know, I was like, I got the job. Yeah, my wife and I drove a 28-foot U-Haul with our car on the back. She came back, helped me. We had owned a house and been working on it like I do here. I do everything in my house, you know. And we sold our house. We towed our car across the United States. My boss had said, when you get here, his name was P.K. Weiss. He said, when you get here, you know, we'll have a place for you to stay. Well, I get there after driving through blizzard in New Mexico and passing on the Bates Motel. You know, I pull into Tucson on the night of the UAASU football game, and there's not a hotel room in place. I call my boss, and you know, hoping he's going to say, "Well, here's where you're going to stay." He was stoned, and he's just like, "Well, see you on Monday." And, you know, it's like a Saturday. And so,
Now, have you ever been to Tucson at this point?
No. So we stayed in this hotel in a place called the Miracle Mile, and we call it the Hooker Hotel to this day. It was just, you know, the shower was green, you know, it was like gross.
Oh.
So don't touch anything, you know. So and then we had to quick move into an apartment because we had this truck full of furniture that we'd accumulated during 2 years in Rochester. And you know, I didn't want to work there, but it gave my wife the opportunity to be able to drive home to California.
Right.
So,
You could be there in 5-6 hours.
Yeah. So she ended up getting a job in Casa Grande, which is halfway between Tucson and Phoenix. And, you know, that's where I think that the Chicago Cubs had their spring training at the time. And so, you know, and then I got into a groove with that paper because, again, they had kind of a non-productive staff, and they had a joint operating agreement with the Arizona Star,
Okay.
And they were the evening paper. So they shouldn't have existed financially except for this deal. But they shared presses and they shared a building and different staff. And so it was more of a featurey paper. So I had to up my game. Well, one of the things that happened in Rochester is my boss, Sroda, made this ridiculous request of his staff. He said, I want you to give me 2 pieces of enterprise a day, which on top of your assignments, which means go find a feature, 2 of them a day in addition to what you're doing on your assignments. And it was like, are you kidding me? You know, that's not easy. And
wow.
But we had 2 newspapers that we worked for on different news cycles. So not only did you have to do that, but you had to shoot your assignments kind of, you'd had to have 2 great shots out of it so that the papers wouldn't run the same picture.
Right. You're really feeding the beast at this point.
Yeah. So I just became this productive beast. And then I go to Tucson and I'm a productive beast. And then this thing happened where one of my, Mari Schaefer, the only woman on staff, this is when the era of men-only photojournalism practically.
Was that the first woman you worked with?
No, I worked with a few others, but
At Rochester?
Yeah.
Okay.
But they were all interns. Well, no, there was a couple old guards, and then there was interns.
Okay.
And I was raised by a feminist. I watched them be abused. I watched them, fight for their positions.
It was a much different time. It was crazy.
Yeah, well, Mari was a great photographer, and finished her career at the Philadelphia Inquirer. But she had this great idea about Tucson had a couple of churches that were sanctuary churches for immigrants, and the immigrants came through the border, I think in Douglas, Arizona.
Oh.
And she wanted to do a story on why they came up here. She wanted to go down to Central America and do the story. So she proposed to do this Mexico, Guatemala trip and go down there and photograph and with a writer investigate the causes of these poor immigrants coming up to the United States. So we had just hired a new publisher in Tucson, and he was the first Hispanic publisher in the whole chain. And he's like, that's a great idea. In fact, let's go send 3 teams down there and really do it. So the one team was going to go to Mexico and Guatemala, one was going to go to El Salvador, and one was going to go to Nicaragua, Honduras, and Costa Rica. And my boss, who used to like to cherry pick assignments and hardly ever shot anything until he realized he could make some money off Arizona Highways magazine or something like that, he chose one of the assignments. And then one day he told me I wasn't going. And I was like, what do you mean I'm not going? I'm like, easily your best photographer. And he goes, yeah, well, I can't run the paper. Well, we're all gone if you're not here. And I'm like, well, I won't be here when you get back. Because that's just bullshit. I work my ass off every day, and you're going to hold back the best assignment of the year because you need me. And that was one of the first times I ever stepped out of the people pleaser thing and just said, yes, sir, I'll do what you want. But it turned out
How did that feel? How did that feel?
It was hard. It was hard.
There's a line you're crossing. I mean, you're telling your boss, no.
Yeah, when I told my bosses in Palm Springs to play me or trade me, I didn't give a crap. But this now 3rd job into the career.
Yeah, 5 years in.
I couldn't lose my job, but it turned out okay for me because my boss's wife did not want him to go to Central America in the worst way because LA Times photographer had just been blown up by a landmine in the Contra War, and she didn't want him being in Nicaragua, Honduras, which was my assignment. So I did that. So I spent 6 weeks in Central America with Ed Humes, who ended up winning a Pulitzer for the Register, and Matt Pritchard, who was a writer from El Paso. That's what I just like.
What year is this?
This is 1983.
Okay. How do you prep yourself for this? 6 weeks is a long time. You got film, cameras, gear. What are you going to take?
I took what I had because I couldn't afford to buy any gear. So I think I probably had a Nikon or a Canon or both. I just kind of have a piecemeal gear. I took a chrome because we were gonna run a lot of color. I took black and white, so I would switch off when I thought it was appropriate.
Wide angle, 130, 105. What was your lens setup?
I don't think I had a single zoom in those days, so I definitely would have a wide angle lens. One of the things I forgot to tell you is one of the things Sroda did to me when I first started at the Rochester paper is my portfolio was heavily 20 millimeter, and he hated it. He hated this lazy wide angle crap I always did. And I was like push into a car crash where literally and be like on top of the guy, and and it's just like, and he says, come in here, like the first week, come in here. Go get your 20 millimeter. And I gave it to him. He puts it in a drawer in his desk. And he says, here's a 28 millimeter. When you learn how to use that, come back and ask for the 20, So I had, learned how to use lenses better by the time I left. Oh, and there was another seminal moment at the Rochester paper. Remember I told you I was the go-getter guy, but I didn't have like clean photography. I had the moment, but I didn't understand like lighting much or natural light or even lighting. And Sroda was a hard ass. He always wanted us to use like 2 or 3 strobes on like environmental portraits. So I just bought a bunch of cheap strobes and strung them around the room with like slaves and no stands or anything. But I learned how to basically light. But I was in the dark room with Reed Hoffman, who still works for Kansas City AP. He's a Nikon school photographer. And Reed took this gorgeous picture in a barn, I think of a horse, and the light was gorgeous. And I said, how did you do that? We're in the dark room, and I'm watching his picture come up. I'm like, how did you do that? And he just looks at me, kind of a smart ass, but I love him. And he says, I shot it right in the first place. And I'm like, oh, what does that mean? He goes, I chose my aperture, I chose the light, I focused it exactly where I wanted it, and I knew exactly what I was going to have. And up to that point, that really wasn't an idea in my head. It was kind of like, just get the moment. It was kind of more of a documentary photographer. And every now and then I get lucky with lighting and stuff. But I wasn't thinking, I was okay with composition, but I wasn't okay with me putting my imprint on how the picture was going to look. I didn't have
style.
I didn't have a style. So I was like, oh. So when I went to, shortly after I probably went off to Tucson, I started to do that. I started to think about it. And I became more of like a more shallow depth of field. Every time I had a chance to get a lens with a 2.8 or something like that, I'd go there. And I just started cleaning stuff up. And my portfolio got cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. And almost to the point where it was antiseptic at times, and it was like, and then I created, that was my style. And a lot of editors liked it, but then I would like go through phases through my career where like, I'm kind of bored with this, let's try something different. And then digital blew my mind because you could shoot it 8 different ways and, didn't cost more money.
Right.
And, you could look at it immediately. And
No, the immediate return. Did that work?
That was radical. So I went to Tucson, I went to Central America. How did I prepare? I don't know. I just went.
Young kid just winged it.
It's kind of scary. It was scary shit.
Did you have a conversation with Carol about it?
Oh, yeah.
How did that go?
It went okay because her mom was still alive, and it was summertime. She had the summer off, so she went to Anaheim, and it was probably the blessing in disguise because she spent that about a month with her mom, and her mom died a couple months after I got back from Central America. And so I come back from Central America, and I could tell you story after story, James Knockway kind of shit that I went through there with the Sandinistas and all that. But
was that, you say that cavalier, but then you also have a bit of like, holy crap kind of tone to it.
Yeah.
But you're a kid. That's the
kid.
first time
Yeah, it was my first like
Central
war kind of experience.
Yeah, Central America. It's crazy at that time.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, this is not the Compton police holding back a guy at a,
No,
mart.
this is
You're on your own if shit
This
hits
is
the
driving in a pickup truck that you rented from, and if you're in Honduras, some agency in a country run by the CIA. And a soldier would wave you down and insist on a ride, and you'd be in the back of a pickup truck with an AK-47 bouncing on the bed because some 15-year-old kid didn't think about, it might go off, that kind of stuff, and then the Sandinistas being on their side of the border, and just pushing the limits of what you could do.
It's nuts, right? I mean, you're a young kid. It's a nuts time. It's crazy. I mean, you're running around the back with God knows who, with guns you don't know how should be going on and off. I mean,
well, our job was our job was not to cover war. It was to cover the refugees.
Right.
So we were constantly trying to get.
They're in a war.
Yeah, there was a war going on. So we were on both sides of the border. We were encountering immigrants waving in from Nicaragua into Honduras because they were running from the Contra War. And we went to the Guatemalan border where there was just this oppressive government there, El Salvador, and we had one too, which we never got to because the CIA blocked off the roads on that part of the country. And we knew the CIA was in Honduras, and the people we did stories on there were like, don't call us on the phone, watch if you're being followed. People were disappearing. It was just messed up. It was kind of like my introduction to America's not all that clean, and there's a history of dirty things. That's the whole Iran-Contra connection, Ollie North and all that was going on. Ronald Reagan was the president, It was crazy. But the interesting thing is I think, maybe not the youngest of that team, but, Ed Humes was in charge. He was the he was working for the Tucson Citizen at the time. He went on to win a Pulitzer at the Register, and now he's an author, and he does nonfiction.
How hard are you pressing yourself to make unbelievable images, though? Because you got 6 weeks, and you want to prove yourself. You don't want to just say you send the best guy, but then he comes back with nothing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, are you really pressing yourself and putting yourself in a situation maybe you got to tell Mrs. Chambers later, boy, that was hairier than hell?
Yeah, there were times like that. We did have that ultimatum to try to stay away from the war, but it would be like in the background, Like we went through a river one time. Ed's driving the car, a rented Land Cruiser from the government, Sandinista government, to go see this Capitan up on the border war. We never saw this guy, but while we were up there, we're going to a river, and, we had press signs on our cars and signs in Spanish that said, please don't shoot, And we went to this river, and he didn't really know how to drive four-wheel drive, and I did, but he didn't let me drive because he was in charge, So I said, put it in four-wheel drive. Dang, he kept not using the cable. So he finally does. We go to the river. We get to this place. Spent a couple of days there. Did a bunch of stories there. The car broke down at one point, but we're leaving, and when we get this used to happen to us when we were there all the time. There'd be somebody thumbing a ride, and we picked them up. We called them campesinos. They were just local people, local farmers, because we wanted to hear their stories. So we're sitting there, and we're in the car, and every now and then there'd be a Sandinista like hanging out behind a tree who'd also get in the car. So now I have a guy with a rifle in my car in a war zone. It's like, am I neutral anymore? So we're riding along with, I think, Sandinista in the car and a campesino in the car. And Matt, who's the Spanish speaker of three of us, is interviewing this campesino guy, and Ed's driving the car, and we're coming to this river, and we're coming to this like gorge where we're like going through this narrow road, and the guy reaches over and touches Ed's forehead between the eyes, and he's like, what is he saying? He goes, that's where they shot the Red Cross guy in this passage right through the windshield. All of a sudden Ed, who wasn't using he's like flooring it. He's in 4-wheel drive. And we get to this river and there's a bridge there. And there was no bridge. And we're like, where did this bridge come from? They blew it up. And it was the day we had gone through. They had blown it up in the morning and rebuilt it since we came back. And that's the kind of touching on the war that we kind of, we didn't get shot at, but we were trying not to do that.
But it was around.
Yeah, I was like like Susan Masalis, who's famous for covering the Sandinistas' takeover of the country, was still working in Managua, and they were one day, 3 guys, they called it the junta. Daniel Ortega, his brother, and Thomas Borge, I think his name is, were in charge of the country. They're the Sandinista leaders. They're walking down the road past my hotel, and I go out there, and I'm like, they had like security, like 2 or 3 guys in front of them, and I'm just doing the backpedaling thing, shooting my brains out. It's starting to rain. I throw. Ed Humes was running along with my camera bag because, trying to keep up. And I'm like, at one point I said, I have to change rules. So he changed film. I'm still doing it. They walk up to this thing called the Ministry of Information, and they're coming up the steps, and there's a soldier standing there. He's got this silver chrome helmet on, honor guard. I'm like, this is great. So here he is. Here they are. And I'm like, that's great. And they go in the building, and I'm, not going to mess with that. I'm like, go in their personal meeting.
Right.
And this guy comes up, and he's like, he's a colonel in the Sandinista army. He's like, give me your film. I'm like, no. I'm like freaking an American in a place that doesn't have relationships with the United States. I'm like, no. And he's like, you will give me your film. I'm like, no. And I'm thinking I'm going to get arrested. And then some what we call NGO American working for a charity that speaks English kind of comes up and tries to help this conversation. He's like, it turns out that the guy with the silver helmet was like their special forces, and if his picture had been published, he'd probably be dead the next day. So that is one of 2 rolls of film I've given up in my life. And but I still have the pictures of them walking, but I don't have that one. But that's kind of stuff that went down there. One day they were going to have this revolution anniversary thing with like 4,000 Sandinistas in the square in front of the church, all in uniform with their AK-47s. And they made us go into a room and search us and put our bags on a truck and drove us there. And I was with Susan Masalis, and she's friends with the junta. And she's like, just follow me, So they take all the press into this little corral, and, where they can sit and watch them make speeches. But we're wandering along the thing. And I'm like, that's the best pictures almost the whole trip, These like grandmas with AK-47s and Sandinista flags dancing to samba music, and it's just like killer stuff. And then finally I get caught and sent back to the thing. But yeah, that was like my first world class adventure. And I've had many since then, but I didn't have kids. I didn't think I was going to, I was kind of like, didn't think about the death part. I didn't think about any of that stuff.
Did you make the photos you wanted to make?
Yeah, I did.
That's what really matters in the end. There's nothing worse than coming back going, I missed it.
No, I came back, and we did multiple sections, and it was killer. And
was it well received?
Yeah, I won some big awards, and I don't know who listens to your podcast, but it's funny because
everybody.
Well, yeah, there you go. In the early 80s, there was a pretty hot-shot group of photographers at the Register, and I remember one of them, who has a very large ego, was like, oh, if I had gone to Central America, I would have killed it, And I'm like, you didn't go to Central America. You're not like 20 some years old. You didn't like put your life on the line for 6 weeks, and so that always stuck with me.
Was that always in your craw?
It was.
I know who we're talking about.
Well, you might not know who I'm talking about, but ended up. I come back. My portfolio, my reputation is rising. I think we won the Robert F. Kennedy Award that year. So we're like, then an opening comes up at the Long Beach paper, and at this point, a couple of months after I got back, I have my own magazine that I get to photograph, lay out, and work with a writer weekly, and it's in color. So I'm like, this is like the best situation possible for making my reputation even better.
Sure.
So
it's all about clips, exposure.
Yeah, so I get this offer to come. Mike Rondo, my buddy, he had got the job at the Register when I moved to Rochester. So he was leaving the Press Telegram in Long Beach, and so they asked me to come on in, and I showed up with attitude. I had like a sweater on, jeans, and I'm like, they took me to lunch someplace where you have to wear a tie, so it's kind of like tied around my neck, and and there was some guy at the table that I didn't really know who he was, but he was asking me all these questions, like journalism questions. I knew the managing editor really well because I'd worked with Rich Archibald, who's still one of my favorite legends of journalism. But I didn't know who this guy was. And but he's asking great questions. And my answers were like brutally honest, which probably make like management like
extremely nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was like actually liking it. It was Larry Allison. He was the publisher of the paper. I didn't know that, And so Did
you do any research? I mean, you knew none of these players?
I didn't know that guy. And so I was like, but they still wanted to hire me. And I like laid my cards on the table like, well, I don't know if I really want to work here. I have a really good situation. I said, where I am. And at this point, my mother-in-law had passed. And so my wife was settled into not moving around and we're kind of getting into our routine in Arizona. So I said, well, you're going to have to, you're going to have to pay me really well. You're going to have to at least pay me what you were paying Rondo, because I have like more experience than he does and a little better awards.
Right.
And I said, and they were kind of, their eyes got big because he was their favorite, and they were like, I can't believe he's talking like this. And then I said, but then I found out from the guy who had been my intern boss. I just bumped into him after lunch, and he said, well, how much are they going to pay you? And I found out that it was a union paper, and I was like up for like double what I made in Tucson.
Whoa!
And I had told him at lunch, I go, look, if you hire me, you're going to have to pay for my move to Anaheim, and you're going to have to pay for my wife to move from Tucson to where she works, and then when she's done working for the year, you have to move her to Anaheim as well. 3 moves. And they're like, okay. This is back in like moving vans.
Right.
I wasn't going to like U-Haul it again, And they agreed to that. And I said, and when my wife's job is over, I want like, I may earn it in vacation time or overtime, but I want like a 3 or 4 week vacation because I won't have lived with her for 7 months. And I used to go back and forth, and it was cool. Like I shot spring training in Arizona and stayed with her. But we had like the most romantic, like, hookups. But I just didn't see her for 7 months. So we basically had our real honeymoon, like in England and in France. And while I was there, I took the job because of the pay. It was like undeniable. It was like, how can I refuse this offer?
And this is 83?
Yeah, and the Tucson Citizen literally took a nosedive right about the time I left. They made it look, they took over like the design of the paper, made it look like USA Today. It started losing readership and eventually went out of business. So if I had stayed, I would have been
watching it crash.
Yeah, so I went to Long Beach, and again, cool things happened.
Did you feel comfortable going to Long Beach, or was it just, it was an opening and you wanted to come back to Southern California? Because
No, I really was going to enjoy this, because the cool thing about working in Long Beach is one, it wasn't the LA Times, and the LA Times was the best paying newspaper in the West, you know, but the LA Times at the time, I would not say this now, this is a great paper, but when I was in Long Beach, I got offered a job there a couple of times, or at least come on in for an interview. Why would you, you know? And I'm like, why would I want to work there?
right, and that's a very true statement. They were not sexy for a while.
No, and in fact, they'd say, I had lots of friends who had done the really hard work of being freelancers and part-time photographers for years before they got a position on the staff. And they're like, why don't you come work here? And I'm like, when are you going to work here? And I used to call the place the Velvet Coffin.
The Velvet Coffin.
And I used to say, when I lose interest in photojournalism, I'll come work for you.
Right.
You know? And they took that as an insult, but they're like, yeah, well, I make like twice as much as you. And I'm like, okay. But I was the big fish in a small staff, and I could shoot anything I wanted. And the first thing that happened was I got to shoot the Olympics, the '84 Olympics. It was just Rondo. Rondo, my best buddy, it didn't work out for him where he went to, I think, with the Hartford Current or something like that. He came back. So now I'm working with like my best friend. We're like covering the Olympics.
Who's on that staff?
Let's see. Leo Hetzel, Tom Shaw, Roger Core. Tom Shaw and Roger Core are like old guard. Mm-hmm. Bob Gann was an old guard. I don't want to leave people out. Lynn Butterworth. Later, after the Olympics, I was the boss for about 6 months, and I hired Hal Stolzley, and I hired Chrissy Salvador. I literally got to hire people.
Right.
It was awesome. Calvin Hom came in after me to do what I was doing. Bill, what's Bill's name? One of the guys I could not stand.
But you worked in the great downtown.
Well, the best part was I didn't have to go to Los Angeles that often, and I hated going to Los Angeles because of traffic, because of the just massive amounts of journalists that would show up for things. So in Long Beach, it was still a city, hardcore issues, and you kind of had the city to yourself. Right. So it was cool. And
you had a major college, you had a port, you had all kinds of things going on.
At the Olympics, everybody gets this story wrong because I don't know. But when I was in England, I was reading a story in the newspapers in England about this South African runner, Zola Budd, who wasn't going to be able to compete in the Olympics because she was under apartheid, but she had dual citizenship, so she was going to run for the British team, and she was going to run against Mary Decker, who was the darling of the track world in America, who had never won her gold medal. And so they ran this race.
Well, because in 1980, Americans didn't run.
Exactly. Yeah. So this was her year. And it was a very American-driven, American USA chant.
Yeah, it's
every
in
day.
LA.
It's in LA.
John Williams is doing the opener, the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Carl Lewis is killing it.
Who opened up? Who did the flame? He was in the '68 Olympics, wasn't he? That opened up the flame, the black gentleman.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Yeah. Rayford.
Yes, Rayford Johnson.
Right. I had all of that, but Michael and I killed it. We were up against the LA Times, which I think they had 50 photographers. Like, they were the paper record for the LA. And then the Register had their 4. They had 3 credentialed and 1 person who just would shoot things with a long lens from the neighborhood, and they were killing it. They had just bought these new presses, and their paper was designed like unbelievably gorgeous, and it was just like, oh crap, I wish I could do that, But that race came up at the end of the Olympics,
and it's the first time that women are running 3,000. Correct? That's what I researched.
It was a 1,500.
3,000. They've said.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Yeah. That's how much I remember about statistics. I just remember I want to go to this race. I had covered that day the
walk me through your day. That day.
That day I'd been working probably 12 or so days. I worked on this awesome team. It's the first time that a newspaper chain had put a team together for the Olympics. So I had David Turnley, Bill Frakes, Bryant, I can't remember his last name, from the San Jose Merc, and Karen Borchers from the San Jose Merc. I had a guy from the Miami paper, a guy from the Detroit paper, a guy from the Philadelphia paper, John Philo, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner for the Kent State shootings. I had I think Frakes was photographer of the year. It was before I started working for SI.
Right. He's still with the Miami paper, right?
Right. And I'm the youngest kid on staff. And the only reason I have a credential is because I'm a local guy, right? So they kept giving me crap assignments, but I kept trying to make the best pictures I could.
Now, who's running the team at this point?
This is even better. David Yarnold, who is the photo editor of the San Jose Merc, who later becomes like the managing editor of the whole newspaper. And the San Jose Merc became the photo newspaper of California at one point under his leadership. And, I was like, I wish I worked there, for a while, but he was just killing it. And like on the other end, his assistant of the phone in San Jose was George Wedding, who I revered because he was a former Pew wife, of photographer of the year. So I'm working with all these, two Pulitzer guys,
major winners.
Yeah, and I'm like the punk rookie, right? And
you look, all of maybe 19 now?
Yeah, exactly.
You've aged all of 3 years.
And I'm like, they're giving me like the cycle road race picture, go out and watch them go under a bridge once on the freeway, And that was a cool picture because it was like, okay, I know the area, so I picked the bridge. And the Americans had those bullet helmets for the first time, and they had like red, white, and blue, and they come zipping underneath me in this perfect grid pattern. And, Bill Frakes is like, that's a bitchin' picture, Bruce, And so I was getting these like perks from these people I really admired. And, the other guy's name was Michael Bryant. He worked for San Jose Merc, and he was like, we had radio. I can't get in too much trouble, I guess. We had radios, right? And we called him Ego One. Everybody did. He was so obnoxiously arrogant. And he got the best assignments because he was the favorite boy of Yarnold, right? So I got my revenge. The day of the Decker Zola Bud race, I went to the Anaheim Convention Center and shot wrestling. Got a couple of decent pictures. And I had to always go to Los Angeles to do all my processing. So, driving into LA, and they're like, hey, why don't you just go home and rest? You've been working like, 2 weeks straight. And I'm like, So I took the bus from and to preface this, when I learned my lesson early. Carl Lewis is going to run the 100-meter, right? And he's favored to win. So I'm up above looking down in the peristyle of the Coliseum. I'm with Rich Clarkson, David Burnett, and I'm meeting these rock stars of my profession, just sitting around chatting. We had to sit there for like 3 hours. David Burnett asked me, like, hey, you got any 400 film, because it's getting, the light was deteriorating. And I'm like, so I gave him some of my film. And then as the race was coming up, the gun goes off. And right before the gun goes off, Walter Yost, walks up, stands there, shoots a picture, and walks away. And I'm like, what the fuck? We've been here for 3 hours, and they're, you have to be here to get your spot. He had some guy like stand there for him, and then he just shows up and shoots a picture. And I'm like, okay, this whole do what they say thing at the Olympics you can get away with a lot of shit. And then I learned that because I shot 4 Olympics total, and I'd be where I needed to be, and I'd have the the volunteer telling me I couldn't be there. And I'm like, go get your supervisor. And by the time he'd get pissed off and give up, I'd get my picture and walk away, you know. That's how, you know, the big boys did it. So I was like, okay. So I learned that lesson. But what I really learned was Rondo shows up for that race, and he's like beyond the finish line. And this you see this for all the time, but this was a first. Carl Lewis wins the 100, and he's jogging the track, waving at the crowd. Somebody tosses him an American flag, and he puts it behind his head, and he's flying the American flag behind his head. Rondo nails this picture. They could give a shit what I shot, right? They don't even want it.
No.
And there are probably 60 photographers on the end zone, looking at the finish line. It's just a wall of photographers.
Right.
Bill Frakes has probably got 5 remotes on the thing, you know? And he's just famous for that, you know? But I was just like, okay, so...
And nobody cares.
Nobody cares. Not after that, because this is the American Olympics, and that was the picture they wanted. So I'm like, okay, this is a big race. I know the story. I think it's important that I go there. I'm thinking, I'm not going home. I'm going to go to the race. So I show up, and I know that I don't want to shoot the finish line. And it is slammed. There's 100 photographers, just like 3 rows of them.
Yeah, tiered. It's ridiculous how it used to be.
So I had seen this picture in a track meet of a runner in the final corner kicking and the guy looking back in shock. I couldn't be inside the track to get that picture, which is where he shot it, but I could be on that corner. So I said, I want to be here when they kick the last thing. So the race starts, and I'm like way down the line. I'm shooting black and white, old Nikon with a slow motor drive, f2.8, you know, and every time they come around, I shoot a couple frames of the pack. And then I'm just kind of like, oh, I think I'll follow them. And while I'm focusing motor driving, Decker gets actually, it's controversial. I think she stepped on Zola Budd, and Zola Budd gets blamed for it because, you know.
Right.
Because nobody's going to say Deckers did anything wrong. It's her own fault.
She was crowding her.
Yeah. She ends up falling, writhing in pain. I shoot the picture. I wait for her to roll over, and I can see out of the corner of my left eye the last runner coming around, and I wait for those legs to go across to give some depth. She rolls over and has this grimace on her face. So I have the whole thing going down and then that, and then I just book it out of the place. I don't even think like to shoot any more of this. And I get up to the top of the stairs, and David Burnett, is standing at the phone. And I'm like, did you get it? And he taps his camera like, yeah, it's in here. And I'm like, crap. So I get on the bus, and I go.
Now, did you realize he was next to you or near you?
No, I had no idea. In fact, he and I are the only ones that were down there that got it. And there was some guy from way down the end has some grainy thing that just looks like crap. And he waited for he was shooting color, and he also had his own agency, and he had like connections to every magazine in the world. So he made a lot of money on his picture of the aid worker coming out and holding her up. He didn't have the collision. So in the contest, it goes back and forth with him and me. Like he won the World Press. I won the POI, you know, that kind of stuff. I was the Pulitzer finalist, but he wasn't. The Register beats me.
Right.
Pissed me off. So
did that really get you?
Yeah, it made me mad for a lot of reasons. But the end of that story, I go into the office with all these rock stars, and Yarno's looking at me like, I thought I told you to go home. And I go, I went to the race. And he goes, did you hear what happened? I go, it's in my camera. He goes, what? He asked, like, who was there? I'm like, I was there. There was somebody signed to it, you know? And they're just not incredulous. Like, I like unwind back my film, you know, and hand him this thing. I go, I cannot process this. I will fuck it up because I'm so nervous. Because you have to go in the dark room and roll it on the reel. So I can't remember the guy's name, but he ended up working he was the lab tech, but he ended up working for the National Geographic later. He takes it in, and he says to me, maybe we should add a minute just in case you underexposed it or something like that. I'm like, okay. So he comes out and he's like, holy shit, it's all here. And, you know, the place goes crazy. And you know, they're making prints. They're sending it all over to all the Knight Ridder newspapers in the world. I'm trying to think of how can I, you know, people are like, you should sell this. We had this deal with Sports Illustrated that they were going to give me $1,000 to look at it. And then they give me like $5,000 if they were going to run it. And I was like, I didn't have any agents, nothing, right? And so we all went to, the best part was Bryant comes running in from the men's final basketball game, who he got because he's the favorite, right? He's like, I got great basketball pictures. And people are just like, are you unclear of what's going on in the world, you know? And, you know, you're not, nobody gives a shit, you know? And that was the best part. So I got elevated to, you know, I got poured champagne on me right there in the room. And then we went to dinner. I'm still wearing a polo shirt with champagne on it. I think I slept there that night because the next day I still had the same stiff shirt on. But we went to some steakhouse, and Yarnold was trying to make this deal with Sports Illustrated. And then the Sports Illustrated people are like, it's black and white. We're not running a black and white picture in our magazine. And I don't know. I think they used like the AP picture that was horrible. And I didn't make much money off of it. But I made friends with David Burnett that day. And we're still friends. And every time I go to the Olympics, I love, you know, we talk about that story. And, you know, it kind of set me up. But then again, that picture, which, you know, got nominated for the Pulitzer, was a finalist. It defined me. Everybody's like, you're the guy who took this picture. That used to really just mean like, wow, you know, like I've done a whole lot more than this, you know, like the Press Telegram made like a 15-foot print of it and put it in the lobby.
But you're what, 25 at the time?
Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you're a kid. You could barely rent a car.
Yeah.
You know, and this is happening.
Well, to answer the question about the register, did that piss me off? Yes. Because I surveyed all these rock stars I was working with. I'm like, okay, if you're going to enter this, because it was pretty obvious that it's weird that a sports picture would make it in the Pulitzer.
Right.
But it was that kind of year. There was like kind of peace in the world, and there wasn't any like mayhem going on in Africa or anything, you know. So this was a big deal, and the Pulitzer is an American award, so you know, and it was the American Olympics. So I'm like, should I enter this as just this event, or should Michael Rondo and I combine a portfolio and submit it as a portfolio of work? And historically, that had never happened. Nobody had ever won for a body of work. It was always a single image, or at least an event, series of events. So they're like, no, don't do it. Well, Michael, he had killed it. Like, God, who was it? The gymnast who competed on a broken ankle. Can't remember the name right now. He got all of that perfectly. We had killer pictures. We had a killer portfolio, but we didn't enter it. And I end up losing to the rivals, who like were fairly arrogant people. And in fact, one time they said, "Hey, you know, we're buddies. Can I borrow your lens?" And my 100, I think. And it was gone for a week. And I'm like, "Where's my lens?" I went up, found somebody in the stadium, and said, "Where's my lens?" And he goes, "Oh, I loaned it so and so. You have to go ask him about it, rather than like I'll go get it for you." And it was like mounted somewhere as a remote camera. And I was like, it was my personal lens too, you know? It was like, I get it back, it has a scratch on it, you know? So I didn't like no love lost with these guys, you know? I know now I look back at it and I go, these guys were working their asses off. They did a great job. They, you know, the universe worked for them because they had the best looking color newspaper in the world. And their entry was blow your eyes out, you know? And, you know, but, yeah, I had to deal with their egos for the next 6 or 7 years. Then I finally applied there. They were all gone.
Right. When the announcement comes down that day that you're runner-up, you're finalist, you're runner-up, whatever, you don't win, how does that sit with you? Were you happy you got that far? Were you disappointed?
Oh, that I didn't win?
Yeah.
Well, this is poignant. My father died that year. I'm in the car leaving the funeral home. I'm sitting in the back seat in a limo with my uncle. My uncle is the managing editor of the Fresno Bee. And he had nothing to do with my interest in journalism. I did this completely without that kind of influence. And my boss, Ann Bailey, from the press telegram, with Michael Rondo, comes up and says, "You did not win the Pulitzer." Because, it's a two-tier thing where one jury picks the finalists, and then another jury picks it. And my uncle looks at me and he goes, "Well, you're too young to win a Pulitzer." And I'm like, how many chances do you get in life? I think his paper won one in the history of their paper, And, I got nominated 6 times, but I never made it to finalist. To say, it cracks me up when people are like, "Oh, I'm a Pulitzer-nominated photographer." I'm like, yeah, that just means that your boss thought you shot the best thing that year.
And nominated it.
And it. Yeah, you didn't get it. So, yeah, I never got there. I was always chasing that Pulitzer. A couple times I thought I had it, this is going to do it, But I didn't live the life that most of the people I know, like the Turnley brothers, lived. They dedicated their entire lives to their craft. I did not. I had a family. I had kids. At one point, against my desires, which was move all the way up to international status, I just decided, well, I'm going to be the best community photographer I could possibly be. And that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to give up this idea of, I had this, the reality, for instance, of National Geographic. You're gone for years on an assignment. You seldom see your family. Not too many of those guys are still married to their original wives, at least. Even my rock stars of photojournalism, many of them divorced.
Oh, yeah.
It's just ridiculous how few of them have been with the same people, I'm always like a Robert Hanashiro. I mean, he's been with his wife forever. I'm like, rock star, still killing it. Just,
But then you can look at another 100.
Yeah, exactly.
Who are on third marriages, don't have relationships with their children, have missed every poignant event in those families' lives.
Yep, that's exactly what it was.
Birthday parties.
So I used to drive back and forth from Anaheim to go to my job in Long Beach during the entire 1980s. I won that. I won finalist. I was winning a lot of awards because I got the best assignments and I had all of LA to shoot. In 1989, I went to Cambodia and did the Killing Fields story, which won the Robert F. Kennedy Award and a couple other things. In POI, I think it was Feature Story of the Year. So I had kind of a reputation again. So I walked into the Register and applied for a job because I was sick and tired of commuting. And all the guys who used to annoy me at the Register were gone. So I was like, okay.
I mean, Anaheim to Long Beach isn't a murderous drive, but
no,
it got to you.
But it's 2 hours a day.
Okay.
My wife used to call me, when are you coming home? And I'm like, oh, I'm still printing. And she would say, well, don't use any bleach. Potassium ferrocyanide, we used to use this poisonous substance to highlight highlights and if you did it wrong, you'd ruin the print. And so, you'd make 5 prints till you got it perfect, and then you try to this stuff, and if you screwed it up, you had to start over
again.
Yeah, so she'd say stuff like that because it was just I was always gone. I mean, I remember being at work when she went into labor. My friend was helping me lay flooring in my house. He's in my house and he's listening to my wife's screams, and he's timing it. He's like, you need to get home, so
she's screaming a lot, buddy.
So I did make the jump, and it wasn't easy. Peter Weinberger was the boss at the time, and he offered me this big salary, and he told me, you don't want to work here because of all these problems. And I'm like, name them. I go, I've worked at 4 papers now, Peter, and that's the problem in every paper. So why would I be cowed by that, you know? And so he goes, well, you're the big fish in a little pond. You're going to be a little fish in a big pond again. I go, this is a good challenge. I need to be renewed.
Did you feel like you were getting stagnant at Long Beach?
Yes, very much. In fact, I had that killer assignment near the end, but, you know, I think I got in trouble. I was no longer the F10 forum editor, but Peggy Peaty, I forgot to say Peggy Peaty when I said who was on my staff, which is a huge omission because she's a killer photographer and an incredible photographer. And she was in charge of the magazine now, but she wrote 2 articles that were very controversial because she was just talking to people at a party and stuff, and she like wrote stuff down, and then people didn't really know that were on record. And you know, one of them was the people at the Register who had won the Pulitzer. You know, at one point, the photographers ruled the Register in the early 80s.
They were the rock stars, really.
They were the rock stars, and everybody there resented it. So they started to get pushback from the writers and the editors. They didn't want them to be in charge anymore. And they were talking smack about their bosses and stuff, and Peggy wrote about it. And a lot of them ended up leaving the paper and going other places. I was talking smack about my company, the Press Telegram, because I thought they were just freaking following the pack. They weren't doing anything
original.
And
Yeah.
I said that. I said they're like a Gucci paper. They just go with whatever everybody else is doing. And I had won a POY award that same year, and I remember my boss calling me into his office, and he's like, you know, Bruce, I'm sitting here reading this great article about how you won, you know, first place news in POY, and then I read the rest of the article, and it says, and I already read it, and I was just like, oh, geez. I go, well, you know, in all honesty, I believe those things, but I would have never said them out loud if I had known it was on the record. But, you know, so then he's pissed at me. Then I got the job offer at the Register. And then my genius boss, Calvin Hom, who I love, you know, and went on apparently to be the rock star of the LA Times in the end, just retired. He goes in to Rich Archbold and he says, hey, we're going to lose Chambers. He got an offer at the Register. You need to give him a raise or something, you know? And he's like, no. And after that, I got no decent assignments. And then the Register had a hiring freeze. And they're like, they told Weinberger, you can't hire anybody. So I was like, out of luck. And this is like the second time I applied at the Register at the beginning of my career. And this time I was like, okay, so now I'm in no man's land because I'm persona non grata at my own paper. And then they hired Ron London, and they lifted the thing, and I was his first hire, and I didn't cut quite the sweet deal that I had been given before, but it was a good move, so I took it. But yeah, I went from being the big shot that I'd worked for at the Long Beach paper to becoming just another one of the 20 photographers at the Register, you know. But that staff was incredibly kind and helpful and mentoring. And
Was it tough to leave Long Beach? Was there a fear being that guy to going to a staff that big?
a little bit. And I have to say, you know, and Rich Archbold, my managing editor of Long Beach Press Telegram's favorite, he was super kind to me in the end. He like threw me a party. He came to the staff party. He's just a class act. And he's just, you know, he was fun to work for. I look back on it now and I'm like, that was one of the best places I ever worked. Even though I worked 24 years at the Register, I only worked 7 at that paper, but that was like a family. And you could walk into, like when I hired Chrissy Salvador, Chrissy didn't have any of her own gear. She was coming from my old paper in Rochester, and we didn't have any. I was working the desk, kind of under protest because a bunch of people had quit. And we were short staffed, and somebody had to do the photo editor, and we didn't have gear for her. So I'm like, God, I had actually literally loaned out my own personal gear to my friends on the staff. I didn't even have a camera. I couldn't even leave the building, and they didn't want me to leave the building. They said, your job is to sit here. And they kept trying to get me to take the job. And I'm like, no, I want to die standing on a hill and see the nuclear blast, and I'm just incinerated while I'm still shooting. I don't want to be at a desk.
Right.
And I'd already done 6 months there. So I go walking into the managing editor's office, and he's talking to Larry Allison, the publisher. And I'm like, knock, knock. Yeah. And I'm interrupting, the two biggest bosses. And I'm like, I have a problem. We're hiring a new photographer. Yeah, I heard about that, And they're like, she doesn't have any cameras. You're going to have to buy her a new set of gear. And he's like, well, don't we have anything we can give her? I go, literally, our gear is falling apart. We're not fully staffed. I have I've given away my personal gear. How much is it going to be? $30,000. He almost had a heart attack. And I'm like, at Adrays, go to Adrays and get
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that name in forever.
I don't think it was $30,000, but it was a lot of money.
Right. No,
right?
well,
so full kit. Right?
There's a couple of cameras, couple of lenses, flash.
Yeah, 3 or 4, a bag and all that stuff. So Allison, he looks at me like, well, doesn't she have her own gear? And I go, Rich, do your writers have their own computers? And this is before laptops and all that. And he's like, I said, it says in our contract with the union that you will provide the tools necessary to do the job. You're not even doing that for us. But now we have a new photographer. Let's at least start her out right. Give her a chance. Don't give her broken gear. And Larry's like, we'll pay for it. So, that place was outstanding. At one time, I think Rich is from Chicago, and I don't know, it's a big NFL game, the Bears game versus either the Raiders, I think it was the Rams. It was a William Perry era, at the refrigerator. And Michael and I wanted to go to the game. One of us wanted to go to the game. And he wasn't going to spend the money. And we're like, dude, you're from Chicago. Come on, man. It's like, I go, you could send both of us and we'd be cheaper than your writer because we'll eat at McDonald's. We'll, share a room. And, we talked him into that. We talked him into going to the World Series, all sorts of stuff. He was just that kind of guy, You couldn't get away with that at a place like the Register. They just like, why are you in my office?
Yeah.
And by the time I got to the Register, the photo staff had been pushed into a service organization position. They had like total disrespect for the photo staff because I think it was resentment because, they had been kings. They had won the Pulitzer. They had won a few individual Pulitzers, but, they hadn't won like a all newspaper staff award.
Right.
Things like that. And they were just like, they just like, it was like,
they ate themselves alive.
It was second-class citizenship, and it was like, you'd do work on a project. Like, I think I shot a few pictures for their Pulitzer that they won about some scam about in vitro fertilization, and, but I didn't claim being part of the team, I don't even know if the picture I shot was in their entry. But, I remember Brusick, the managing editor. Well, when I first started working there, this is hilarious. This is the interview I had. Chris Anderson is legendary editor. He's just super colorful, somewhat, I should choose my words so he doesn't sue me. Famous for the way he treated women. Infamous. But an innovator, and he was often like the Register's the first paper to ever, like, we were the paper without walls. They ripped all the walls down and everybody sat together and worked together, and that was his idea. He's always come up with ideas, and he had people who worked for him who had ideas, which were often very painful ideas. But I went there for my interview series, and I started at the bottom with like the assistant photo editor and worked my way up to him. And when I came in, they're like, why should we hire you? And I'm like, you're getting your ass handed to you by the LA Times Orange County Division in news. And I am a news photographer, and I will catch you up. And they're like, we don't care. We're a proactive newspaper, not a reactive newspaper. And I'm like, what does that literally fucking mean? You know? Like, that's what I'm thinking. And so then I asked somebody, what is that supposed to mean? And they basically said, well, basically, they don't like breaking news. They want to be like, you know, the paper that kind of like tells the world how topic-driven journalism, which is fine. But I'm like, yeah, but people buy the newspaper to know what's going on in their community.
Yes.
And you're just kind of ignoring it, you know? And so by the time I got to Chris Anderson's office, you know, he's the big shot. He's the alpha male of alpha males. And he's like, so what should we do? What would you do to make this paper better? I'd say, I'd put a helipad on your roof and buy a helicopter. And he just laughs. And I'm like, I go, dude, could you imagine how fast you could respond to news, how dominant you would be in this area if you could do that? He's just like, And then he says, well, what are you offering to me? And I said, well, I'm a proactive photographer. I learned the language, you know. And I got I took the P test, the drug test, and I ended up, you know, then they hiring freeze for about 3 months, and then I finally got the job. But when I got there, it was kind of, the photo department was kind of demoralized. Ron London was a great guy, loving, kind, compassionate guy, but holy crap, you know. We did have Sroda, who won the Photographer of the Year my first year. In fact, I edited that portfolio. He came in one day and he's like, because I've been editing my own film for like 10 years. And he's like, can you look at my portfolio? And I'm like, first question. He goes away. He goes to get a drink or something. And I'm looking at all these slides. And he comes back. And I had changed all sorts of stuff. Like, he shot this killer story on refugees coming from Mexico, or Central America and Mexico, to the United States. But he had been trying to shoot a story that followed one person all throughout. And he didn't really have it, but he had the representations of everything that happens along the way with different people, including like running across the freeway and getting hit by a car and dying, and then having your body taken back to Mexico. And I was like, I mean, he like shot refugees down in Pendleton trying to run across the freeway when they first put that sign up of the fleeing refugees.
Famous sign, sure.
Throwing rocks at him because they didn't want to be in his pictures, you know. And his pictures are a little blurry because he was chasing them. And then he had guys living homeless, and he had guys, you know, he had this whole story. And I go, the story's here. You just don't see it. It's not the story you wanted, but it's the story you did. And then he had this story of, so I still had this photo editor chops, but I never wanted to be the photo editor. And another story that he shot in register color, he did all these gels and crap, but it was about Asian gangs. Killer pictures. I go, you need to convert this to black and white because the judges will just hate this.
Right.
And he's like, really? And he had one sports picture in there, and he's like, I go, this is shit. You cannot put this in your portfolio. He goes, well, how can I win a portfolio competition without a sports picture? I go, it's a weak photo. Don't do it. So he won, I think 3 different stories won. And I looked at him. I'm like, Paul, how did you shoot all of this in a year? So this comes back to my philosophy. How would you possibly put this much effort into your work? He goes, I got divorced this year. I'm like, there it is. You poured yourself into work because you don't have that connection now. You know, and, you know, I just didn't want to do that. So I ended up, that was the year Bill, I think I wrote it in Facebook, Bill Alcoffer was employee of the year. So we had this like crazy night celebration of who's the employee of the year down in the Register's theater, and they call Bill up and call him, you know, he's the employee of the year, and he earned it. The guy's a rock star, hard worker. And then we get a phone call from POY coordinator to tell us that Paul won POY same night. So we had like this duality thing going on. So even though we had these rock stars, they still treated us like crap, you know. And a famous, you know, phrase from Ken Brusick, who I learned to love over the time, and I think he loves me in return.
That must have taken a lot of work.
It was. He said one time, he had this philosophy. He's like, you know, life is like a river where the blood from the tragedies flows down the river, and we only report the bloody river. We don't talk about the life on the banks. So that was his big beef. And I'm like, I get that. But you have this huge staff. The blood is still a story, you know? And I still kind of had this, like, jack of all trades kind of background. So I'm like, there was a shift called Metro Dog, 9 to 6, Monday through Friday. And we rotated all our shifts. So for 6 weeks, you'd be the Metro Dog. Your job was to chase the news and to pick up all the assignments that had been kicked out by the photo department, but during the morning meeting, they're like, no, you will do this. So that was kind of the dog part, you know, you like, got crap. And when I was on night shift, I'd always shoot sports. And then one day I famously quit sports because I was so tired of, back in the day when you shot the Lakers, for instance, you'd go to the Forum, you'd get there 2 or 3 hours early, you'd go up in the catwalk and you turn on the strobes. You drop the cord down to the floor so that you could do all this so you didn't drop anything on Magic Johnson's head, right? And there's a few famous incidents where people drop stuff, you know. But so you'd be there hours before, and you usually drove right through South Central on the way there, you know, and then you'd shoot for 15 minutes on chrome. And you can only shoot a frame every 3 seconds or you'll blow up the pack. So you get about a roll of film done in that time. And there's no review because it's not digital. And then you run for it. And you talk somebody else into turning your packs off from some other agency. And I don't know how many times I came back from the game. I invested 5 or 6 hours in it. I came back. I had a picture, an okay picture, and they're like, well, we dummied a horizontal and all you have is verticals, so we were going to use an AP picture. Or we didn't know you were there, so we used an AP picture. I'm just like, I was getting irate about it. And then I tried a Bill Alcover thing one day where I lit a high school game with strobes down in South County, and I waited till the last minute possible to grab my gear and run up to the register in Santa Ana and process the film. I had the best picture, sports picture of my year, and they're like, the same thing. It's a horizontal, we can't run it, we have a vertical tool. And Chris Carlson was the sports photo editor. I said, I quit. I'm sick and tired of this. So I went to work for the Metro section.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of my conversation with Bruce Chambers. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the like button and become a subscriber to the podcast. Remember to follow the Just a Good Conversation podcast on Instagram, and you can find all of its past shows on the website at justgoodconversation.com. Thank you for listening.